I'm from Ontario originally, and hey, all right. But when I was 18, for some reason, my parents let me move out by myself to Banff, Alberta, to be a ski bombing instructor. So my first home away from home was Alberta, and it's actually been years since I've been back, so it's really great to be here. And thank you to Lisa and everyone for having me. Really excited to talk to all of you. I think it's pretty impressive that on a Friday night you're at a sustainability summit versus all the other things you might be up to. So thanks for being here. And as I said, I'm from Ontario, and I grew up in a small town right along the Niagara River. And when I was about 6 years old, Love Canal happened. Has anybody heard of Love Canal? So a lot of you are environmental students, so you've heard of it. For those who haven't, Love Canal is still known as one of the worst toxic incidents in the world. It happened in Niagara Falls, New York in the 70s. And basically there's a situation where a developer built an entire suburban community on top of land that was completely contaminated. It had been industrial land, heavy chemical use, and it was not remediated, and an entire community built on top. And it wasn't until the kids started getting leukemia and dying did people really figure out what was going on. So has anyone heard of cancer clusters? When they start to find a lot of people who have the same kind of cancer in a given community, and they use that to try and figure out what's going on environmentally. That was the first situation where they really even came up with that idea. And they saw that these kids were dying because of where they lived. And I was, as I said, pretty young, and I remember that really struck me at the time that there's something fundamentally wrong when we know that something is contaminated, and yet we go ahead and we risk human lives and we risk people's security and their well-being to make a buck. So that really stayed with me my whole life. And you know, some people came into environmentalism because they were lucky enough to grow up in Banff, Alberta, or many other beautiful places. But I grew up already with the sense that the world was pretty messed up. And so my entry was not, you know, I eventually got into the woods and the big trees and whatnot, but it was more of a place of coming from it from injustice. So I really wanted to understand, why do people act in the opposite way of really what is in our best interest in many cases, when the science is very clear, when often the laws are very clear? Why do we do the opposite thing that we should be doing? So that's really shaped my work, my whole life, my education. I went to McGill for undergrad, and I combined arts and science, so film and communication with environmental studies. Then I ended up heading down to California and did the same kind of degree. And coming out of that, I was really trying to figure out, how do we close the gap between the concern that pretty much everybody has? I mean, no one wakes up in the morning and thinks, boy, I'm going to have a good time wrecking the environment today, right? It's just not, it's not the way it is. But yet, typically, even though 65, 85%, sometimes 95% of the public say they care, less than 10% act. Why is that? What's getting in the way? What's it getting in the way of us doing the right things when we know enough to move in that direction? So we focus on trying to answer that question through a combination of research and training and consulting. We also run the Climate Access Network, which is a network now close to 2,000 leaders in climate and sustainability who all share the goal of trying to build public support for climate policies and energy programs. And really, the big goal here is that I feel that the public's role in change has been fundamentally underrated. Typically, a policy solution, science solution is dreamt up, and then the goal is to sell it to people. But that's not what creates change, and that's not what creates the kind of transformational change that's needed to make the transition to low-carbon, resilient communities. If you look at social change, history, transformations on a major scale throughout time, it has happened when the large number of people in the culture all engage in actions that have political, economic, and social consequences. So for example, things were used like the grape when farm workers in California were pushing back against big agribusiness and trying to fight for their rights. Why was that effective? Because it was something that was in everybody's everyday life. When you went into the grocery store, it didn't matter where you lived, anywhere in Canada even. There were California grapes. And that started to be a symbol of protest, that you could say no to the grape. And that actually did hurt the big agricultural producers in California because it ended up being a massive boycott. But it was more important because there was nothing quite as symbolic of the plight and the identities involved with that struggle than the grape. It was emblematic of something much bigger. So we absolutely need the public's role in making the transition that's necessary. And there are a few other reasons besides history to point to. The first is that, given where we're at, does anyone think we can continue to wait for the federal or provincial government to act on climate? No, waiting is not going to get it done. And even if it were to be the case, policy change takes a long time. And once you get the legislation you want, that's when the real effort is needed, because there needs to be constant citizen voice, calling for demand for enforcement, calling for the ideals to be lived up to that were set out in that piece of legislation. Once you get legislation signed, the work just begins. Think about what's happened with the Endangered Species Act in Canada. Great legislation under attack since the day it was signed. The other thing is that it's pretty well established that behavior change and policy change are absolutely linked. That people who tend to support policy are people who take the actions like drinking out of one of these instead of buying the plastic, disposable bottle. That those things actually do matter because they're an expression of our values. It's a way to identify ourselves as caring. And ultimately, those steps, one adds up to the other until you're interested in a topic maybe you never thought you would, like the environmental consequences of free trade agreements. It does all lead there. The other thing is whether or not you believe that we need a top-down, expert-driven, policy-focused solution for climate change, which impacts every single aspect of our life, every environmental, social, political, cultural, justice issue you can imagine, if we think it's just going to be a small group of experts to figure that out. I don't think so. I think that we need emergent thinking. I think we need 1,000,001 solutions to come from all of you and your households and your apartments and to be the models, right? That's the kind of change that's needed. So how do we get that to happen? So tonight I want to talk a little bit about where Canadians are at overall with their opinion on climate, what the barriers are for engagement, but what the opportunities are, where the excitement is. And finally, to make a request for all of you. So first, where are Canadians at? I think it's really important when you're turning to polling to try and inform any decision is not to take one snapshot of a view, but to look at the trends over time. And so what's really interesting is that for quite a long time, the majority of Canadians absolutely accept that climate disruption is real and that it's important. Much higher levels than in the United States and in the UK, so that's really good news. You do see a drop, it dropped, it did drop, and who can remember when that drop was, when everyone's talking about how no one cares about climate change anymore? Yeah, and so right around that time, like 2009 into 2010, that was when it started, and everyone said, oh, nobody cares about climate change anymore. Don't talk about it. It's dangerous to talk about it. People never stopped caring about climate change. What was unusual was the really acceleration up to high numbers, which got even higher in the earlier 2000s. That was what was unusual. We've had a mega majority of issue acceptance on this issue for years, so that's not the problem. Enough people accept this to get going. So what is the problem? Well, the details are really murky. Most people say, yeah, actually, I'm pretty familiar with what global warming is all about. But then you look at, can they actually connect that back to CO2 and the role between CO2 and the burning of carbon and the problem of climate change? No. That's a really hard jump to make. And it's not that people are stupid. People aren't stupid. It's just that people are busy with other things. They're not in the weeds on these issues like those who really prioritize the environment. The other thing is that people are just worried about other things more. Everybody does care about the environment, absolutely. But probably are a little bit more worried about, am I just going to make my rent this month? Do I have enough money to get by? What do I need to do to get to get all my papers done and get my exams passed so I can graduate, right? You're worried about other things. Everybody is. Putting food on the table, taking their kids to soccer, whatever. And part of that is that the challenge is very murky to most people. It's a hard thing to wrap your head around, imagining that we could possibly have an impact on the earth that would be so monumental. And it's even harder to imagine what our world will look like with 2 to 4 degree temperature change. Very tough stuff. So even though you have acceptance, even though most people are concerned, even if they can, worry about other things more, what you don't have is a sense of priority. And this is something that has not budged. We do similar work in the States, and we've looked at this since 1997. Climate change is typically at the bottom of the list of priorities. If it's something people self-identify, it doesn't even make the list. If it's amongst environmental issues, it still doesn't register. It is a complex issue, and once you let it into your thinking, it is hard to wrestle with the consequences. So it's no wonder that a lot of people don't have time to think that through and make it a priority. But something even deeper is going on. And that's really the challenge of what we call the climate efficacy gap. The challenge is that when people care, which many, many people do, all of you care, but there's no sense of where to go with that concern. There's no real evidence that solutions are emerging, and there aren't really good signs of leadership. How does that make you feel? A little bummed out? Little depressed? Really, maybe I'd rather go shoot pool and have a beer than worry about that right now, because I don't see the path forward. I don't see where to go with my concern. It's a very natural response when people feel tension from a threat, but there's nowhere to go with it to want to turn in the other direction. And I think this is perhaps one of the biggest challenges that we have right now when it comes to climate engagement. There are some other really interesting things going on with the public that are important to mention that aren't specific to climate education, but obviously climate change and environmental concerns, they don't operate on their own. They're held in context with a whole bunch of other concerns and values that we have. And there's some interesting things happening, and maybe you guys can relate to this. So for the first time, when polled, Canadians do not believe that the next generation is going to be better off. That's been part of our story, that everyone works so hard so the next generation can have it better. Do you feel like you are going to have it better off than your parents, your grandparents? And it's not just you that feels this way, it's a lot of Canadians, right? But Canadians under 30 aren't buying into the story anymore. Also not buying into the story that the current economic model is really benefiting all of us. So while this may not seem important from a climate engagement, climate communication standpoint, it's critical, because this is actually what people are really concerned about. And one of the solutions to it is to address climate change and start investing in clean energy, in low carbon solutions that are going to give you guys jobs, that are going to be exciting, give life meaning, something to shoot for, something to be part of, a huge transition to things that bring multiple benefits. So that's part of what we need to do now, is reframe the climate debate as something that is not just for experts and scientists, but that is about all of us and what's most important to us, which is having a life and having a future. So a couple of other challenges to point out, and then we'll get into some of the opportunities. One of the things that happens with climate change is that it's typically framed as an environmental problem. Now, you're all into sustainability, so that may make sense to you perfectly fine. But for most people, when something is associated with being an environmental issue, it falls into the bucket of terrarium, which means that's not me, it's over here, right? I don't have to worry about it if it's about plants and animals. I don't have to worry about it because it's over here and I'm a human being. I am not the earth, I'm separate from that, right? So still, even though people are waking up to climate impacts more and more, there's still a sense that global warming is impacting polar bears and animals other animals and plants more than human beings. And if it is human beings, then it's not human beings here. It's human beings far away in countries that are a lot poorer and struggling. That instantly discounts the challenge in people's mind. It puts it into that off in a bubble, away from me. So framing it as an environmental issue versus all of the other things I just mentioned is limiting. The other thing that's really important is this not me, not here, not now. Global warming is still very distant in time and space to people. And even when we have things like unprecedented events in the Philippines, Canadians' response is, oh man, that's really too bad for the Philippines, but we don't have it like that here. In fact, global warming might actually make it warmer everywhere. That would be good. We could actually start producing red wine in the Arctic, right? Like agriculture will just move north. Everybody will just move north. We've got it good in Canada. Versus really understanding the fundamentals of disruption, that the systems are all coming apart. We're not just going to be able to all move north and grow some oranges and do really well. Another challenge, and maybe this is something that you all can relate to, but there is a whole aura of inevitability around the development of fossil fuels, that it's going to happen one way or another. So how do you want it? Do you want it to go by rail? Do you want it to go by pipeline? Part of what is driving this is just media coverage on oil sands expansion. And part of it is that we really don't see the solutions yet emerging around us. And particularly when people are at an early stage of change, when they're just trying to figure out if this is a problem that relates to them and what can be done, if you don't see the solutions emerging, it's pretty hard to get excited and hopeful and motivated. So one of the benefits that we have in British Columbia is because we've had more than 5 years of a carbon tax, and because we've had things like the Greenest City Initiative in Vancouver, you can see the visible signs of something else emerging. And it is exciting. It really keeps growing. You know, you see that the entire roof of the Vancouver Convention Center, which is more than an acre, is full of endangered birds, plants, bees, insects, because it has a green roof. You start to think maybe something can actually be different, and maybe I could even play a role. But it's very important when focusing on solutions that we don't push them too far into the future. Who's heard the term clean energy future used? All the time, right? Okay. Well, it sounds lovely, but the problem is it sounds really far away, like something we're never going to get to, or that's something that will just inevitably happen, that we don't have to try to make happen, that technology will eventually save us, and at some point in the future we'll have all of these wonderful clean energy technologies. So really, really critical that people start to see the solutions, because that's just not the case now. Another big thing, you probably hear this a lot too, well, it's actually not that important that Canada acts on climate change, because we really have such an insignificant percentage of the global emissions. Why bother? We should be making the money that we can, because we're not the problem. And even if we are, it's going to be better for Canada to develop oil and gas resources, because we have gold standard environmental management practices, right? So we can do it better than other countries. Now, the challenge with this is that as long as we frame the issue of pipelines and transport of oil and gas via rail and all of these things, as long as we're just talking about spills and worried about water pollution, we don't get to the big problem, which is that you cannot develop a gold standard environmental management plan that will stop the carbon emissions from happening, right? So we actually have to call it what it is, not be afraid to say the C word, that there's climate change. It's on our minds. And we need to start, at least, if we're going to go ahead and take advantage of our oil and gas resources, maybe that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, but let's at least set aside some money to put into the transition, because we need to see those solutions emerging. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do with all these trends, with all these challenges? Well, there's a lot. that can be done to move the public along into being those partners in change. And the first is to stop arguing about the science of climate change. It's settled, okay? That's done. Most climate engagement efforts, most people start to talk about the issue and they want to lay out all the science. That's how you're going to convey the threat. I'm not saying the science is not needed or not important, but would you, with anyone in any part of your life, start a conversation by trying to compel them to do something with a really hefty scientific argument? No, it's not how it's done, right? We need the facts, but we have to be motivated because we care. So how do we get that concern to happen? The science debate is polarizing. We don't need to rely on that anymore because, unfortunately, climate impacts are happening all over the place in communities all over Canada. And people are waking up to this. So there's a whole other option to really focus on. Let's talk about what we're noticing around us. Let's talk about what we're seeing coming in the near term. And let's figure out together what the action plan is to prepare for those impacts, to prepare our communities to be secure and prosperous in light of the changes to our climate. Focusing on local impacts also means that you don't even have to talk about climate change as a starting point. I think it's important to typically get there. But if someone is more concerned about avoiding flooding, like what we just saw in Calgary not too many months ago, then you could start the conversation with flooding and move to climate over time. So let's talk about what we're seeing, let's explore that, and let's move through what we're going to do about it. The good news on this is that this is not really about waiting for a big nasty storm to happen. What people notice most about changes to our climate is shifts in the growing season. It's things like talking about the fact that the apple blossoms came in 2 months too early, but then there was a weird freeze and they all died, and now the apple farmers are not going to be able to get the same harvest in. Or why is it so warm in Edmonton in January? You know, when I first got here, the streets had ice all over them and now it's soaking wet. I didn't even need my coat today. Don't you think that's strange? Right? That's a totally different conversation to have. And we all talk about the weather all the time. It's a very natural entry point. People don't make the connections. This is a complex issue. A lot of people don't know that burning fossil fuels is a key driver of climate disruption. Let's make the case. Let's talk about the fact that even if we have the best environmental management practices in place, that we cannot afford, either for Canada or for the world, the carbon emissions associated with that type of development. As I said, focus on solutions. But this can't be, again, things that are far off in the future or overly idealized. This is about things that people want, like solutions that make their homes more comfortable because the temperature is better controlled with efficiency, particularly when we're getting the really bad cold snaps and then the really, really big heat waves, right? That people want good public transit because they're sick of spending a lot of time in the car driving around and not doing what they want to do, right? That the solutions need to be relevant to what people care about, and they can't be pushed off in the future. They need to be things that are happening now because the transition is already underway, right? There are changes happening all over Canada, all over the world. The transition to clean energy and low carbon reality is on its way. And we need to tell that story, and we need to amplify it, and we need to yell it from the top of the roofs. We also really need to think about making the moral call to action. This isn't just about dollars and cents and how much money that you can save on your energy bill if you put in a little bit more insulation or you decide to weather strip the windows in your apartment. This isn't just about the polar bear. This is about us. This is about us and what is doing the right thing in light of what we know. And it is time that we really stop being afraid to say there is this line in the sand. And what side of history do you want to be on? Do you want to be on the side where we denied this enormous problem and left it all to you, and then you leave it to your kids? I don't want to be on that side of the line. I certainly don't. Let's make it obvious to other people that that is the exact situation we're in right now. It's not about the future. We're at that deciding point now. The crossroads is right now, and particularly for Canada. Do we want to continue to rely on natural resource extraction, or are we something better than that? Are we more innovative than that? Are we smarter than that? Do we not have better leadership capability than that? I think we do, and I think we have the resources and the moral responsibility to take up that charge and return to the kind of Canada that wasn't afraid to make the Montreal Protocol happen versus pulling our way out of Kyoto. Besides making the moral call to action, I think a key part of the theme of your whole conference is that people matter in this. This isn't just about the natural systems. We did a lot of work to try to figure out what are the values that people have to really care about the environment. Well, you know what? There's no set list. There's so many different values that cluster that lead to it. But when people really don't care and don't prioritize it, we know what's missing. And what's missing is a sense of meaning in your life, that you actually have a purpose, that your life is important, and that you're part of a community that you're excited to be a part of, that respects you, and that you find meaning from. People want to feel like they have a purpose, and they want to be liked by other people. So all of our climate outreach strategies needs to have basic connecting of people to one another, for inspiration, for hope, for solidarity, and to become that 1,000,001 base of solution, and to know that you're not the only one out there. You're not the only sustainability group out there having this conversation. It's happening everywhere. And we get a sense of power and strength from knowing that we're not alone, and that what we're doing is actually phenomenally important. I mean, all of you really have the biggest task ahead of you. But it's exciting because it's about innovation. And it is about creating something that is very much possible. So I'm going to leave it with that, and I said I would end my talk with a request. So my request to all of you is that you help be ambassadors of hope, that you help fill the climate efficacy gap by continuing to try to walk your talk with your actions, by supporting events like this, by getting involved with policy. But a lot of times people ask me, how do you work on climate change and not get completely depressed? What gives you hope? And I want all of you to be able to answer that, because we need to be able to say why this challenge, while it is overwhelming and potentially devastating, is an exceptionally exciting challenge for innovation and for all of us to have an incredibly important task ahead and that meaning in life. So thank you all for what you're doing, and I look forward to discussion. And I think it's really important to separate, obviously they're connected, but someone having a lower socioeconomic status has virtually no bearing on whether or not they care about the environment. The only demographic factor that really is consequential is what you said, which is education. So obviously there's a privilege piece tied to that, so they are related, but the concern doesn't come because of that. What education allows you to do is to train your brain to think systemically, so that you could all understand why I would be talking about oil sands, pipelines, and climate change. But for a lot of people, those are loops that are hard to move through, because systemic thinking, which is basically the ability to process what's called complex causation, is a learned skill. Not everyone has it. A lot of people have experience with it in their life. So if you live in a big city and you use public transit a lot, you get that if there's a delay in one part of the system, it impacts the whole system, Or most people get that with airports, that there could be something really bad that happens with a storm in Toronto and it could impact flights in Edmonton, right, in and out of Edmonton. So there's some experience of it, but the actual sort of processing doesn't come that naturally. So education is hugely important, but for others, there are definitely ways. I mean, people have the values, again, at all different levels of economic society. Part of it is what are the other ways to really connect? And for people who are at, sort of earlier stages of change, of sort of, even if they care but they haven't gone through steps to really figure out what to do, experiential education is very important, experiential learning. So rather than someone just telling you or giving you information about it, experiencing something. So for example, back to the point I was making about the changes in the growing seasons, there's evidence that shows that these extreme weather events, as well as changes in particularly extreme weather events, that for those already on the poles, sort of the very much I agree with climate change, I think there needs action, or I don't think it exists and it's not human-made, when a big storm happens or an extreme weather event, both of those poles use it to confirm what they already believe. So it's called motivated reasoning. So they're like, see, I told you, these crazy snowstorms, there is no global warming. Or, see, look at these snowstorms. I mean, I told you there's climate change, right? So they're both doing the same things, but from the different poles. The people in the middle are going through experiential learning. They're waking up because of the flooding. They're waking up because they are hearing about the droughts and the heat waves, hearing about the changes in the growing season. So there's a lot of ways to really create change. The other thing is through arts and culture. I think we often just sort of think about information, and I'm going to compel you by having a great argument. But there's been a lot of interesting campaigns and work around embedding climate information and experiences into art projects. So in Belgium, for example, they had this event called Sing for the Climate. And they had thousands of people all over the country writing songs, recording songs, and submitting them that were these very emotional responses to climate change, like how it makes me feel, not just like, well, let me argue with you about whatever percentage of scientists agree or disagree, right? So arts and culture are also hugely important. But I think mostly is just respecting that people do care and meeting them where they're at and finding out what their barriers are, and work with them that way, so, yeah.
How do you find common ground with industry perspectives, especially when there's this polarization and industry claiming that the environmental sector is not using the facts?
Well, I think it depends who you are, what your motivation is, what kind of an organization you're with. I think there is a role for some people in watchdog advocacy organizations to be very much holding the line and trying to keep industry accountable. I think there's a big question, though, around the sort of choice of opposition positioning, opposition language. And the problem with that is that it's alienating for a lot of people who care and maybe don't find that they have another choice right now except for to work in that industry, but they actually might be with you otherwise, right? So there's no point in demonizing people who work in the sector, because we are all completely hooked into oil and gas. And if you start going, you work up in the fort, then they're like, well, you environmentalists, how did you get here? Didn't you drive? Right? So there's no point in that. There's a totally different way to communicate where we really say, look, we all have to get off this stuff. We all have to do it. And we understand that maybe there are some ways to do it better in business. Maybe there's some different approaches. So start there and find that common ground. There's been a lot of interesting experiences in sustainable business work where by going into sort of common areas of solutions, it actually gets business leaders to fundamentally question the business that they're actually in. So an example is interface carpets. Has anyone heard of interface carpets? So Ray Anderson was really amazing CEO, a major sustainability leader. And he basically said, we're not in the business of creating carpets and flooring material anymore. That's what we thought we did. We're actually in the business of providing a flooring service. And they completely changed the business model to no longer sell carpet and flooring material, but to lease the materials to people. So they actually held responsibility for the entire life cycle of that product. And they redesigned it so that, let's say, like in a hallway here, okay? You're walking along. So what's the part of the carpet that gets worn out? Is it the part along the edges? No, it's the part in the middle, right? So they started to design them to be, rather than huge giant pieces of carpet, to be squares that connected together. So if there was a part of the flooring that wasn't good anymore, you pop out that square and you just put a new square in. You don't waste it all. They fundamentally rethought their business by asking themselves, what are we really in the business of? And I would love more oil and gas companies to ask themselves that question. They're in the business of providing energy that should be safe, clean, affordable, reliable. And if that's really the business that they're in, then we got to question the current model, right? There's a lot of other ways to deliver energy that would be safer, provide more security, but give us the same operational ability in our culture. But I think don't demonize anyone. There's no point. I mean, look in Canada, we all are relying on this economically right now. Let's be honest about that. But let's talk about that we do want something else. We want at least another option. We at least don't want all of our eggs in one basket.
Is there one thing that you'd like everyone to know about in terms of climate change issue? If you were to approach anyone on the street, what would you like them to know?
That is a really interesting question, because as someone who does communication and public engagement, my natural tendency is to say, well, I would ask them first who they are, what they're up to. You know, I wouldn't just walk up to someone on the street and say, you should be, you know, getting a really efficient furnace at home because of climate change. So that, you know, I think that's the trick, right? Is that we're not trying to tell everyone, here's what you need to know. We're trying to have a dialogue. We're trying to exchange information, share our values. So maybe what I would want to do is ask, when it comes to climate change, what do you think about and what do you care about? And where do you find the hope? Because that's what I'm looking for. Where do you find the hope? Where do you get that sense that we can work our way through this? But I think it's not saying that we know that one thing. It's actually being humble and saying we have to ask people what they think that one thing might be, or that million and one, yeah.
I'm having problems with you suggesting that we ought to demonize sex for women, especially when they're well-funded and they're putting out these messages constantly saying, like, you know, let's put those pipelines, or we show tar sands plants in the middle of these beautiful green oases. Okay, they may not be demons, but they're certainly manipulative, and they're well-funded. So what's the best way to counter that?
So what I said is I don't think everyone should. I think some people actually have a very important role to play in calling it as it is and calling out some of the challenges and the manipulation and the dishonesty, absolutely. But I think the idea that there's sort of one thing that we're all going to do and that should be the strategy is problematic, because, you know, earlier today I was with people who work and do sustainability work in rural Alberta. They're not going to get anywhere trying to demonize the industry. It's their husbands, it's their wives, it's their cousin, right? So it's about who is the right messenger for the right message to get to the right audience. I think that's really critical. I don't think we should all do one thing. We shouldn't all necessarily be focused on, you know, calling out the opposition. But I do think that there should be a concerted effort. You just have to think carefully about who's in the best position to do that and you know, for what purpose. What I think is really important, I think you can have a conversation about, that is not about demonizing the industry, but I think we have to hugely question the basis of our democracy right now in Canada. So I would far rather have a conversation about the fact that Stephen Harper gutted most environmental laws, has muzzled environmental scientists, is using the resources of the CRA to try and audit environmental charities to death who oppose an oil sands expansion agenda. I would rather talk about the fundamental attacks to our democracy that are occurring than demonize any individual, right? So there's a way to do it. There's a way to do it. But some people should call out exactly what you said. It's just that it doesn't need to be the whole choir.
In certain Scandinavian countries, people's lifestyles generally are very pro-environmental. Because they're immersed in nature. Here in Canada, our lifestyles are very fairly isolated from nature's provincial parks and national parks and places we tend to occasionally go to. My question is, since you were talking about how what matters, one of our challenges is that environmental concerns is not too great of a concern because we have a bunch of other daily challenges that we have, such as paying bills and all of that. And it seems to me that if we make the environment more of a lifestyle as a part of us, as I am part of the earth as opposed to the earth and me are two separate things. Global warming affects polar bears, not me. But how can we, as an organization, as environmental senators, as nature warriors, however you would like to call yourself, how can we influence people to make nature a part of their lives? It's not a moral obligation now, it's an extension of ourselves.
Well, I think in some ways it's happened already. You know, I think part of the evolution of environmentalism and what people are concerned about is sort of nature far off and away, you know, the big beautiful parks and the big megafauna. And it's now, okay, for example, like how many of you are really into local food? Okay, how many of you try and go car free? Okay, how many of you are into bike riding? Okay, how many of you try and use natural cosmetics? How many of you use toxic cleaning products at home? Okay, work on that. No, just kidding. Just kidding. So I think to some extent it's happened, right? That it is about us. It is about our choices. It is about our lifestyle. So there's a few challenges in that now. So there's a lot to work with there. I mean, I think the local food movement is an excellent example of what we could do on energy, because the importance of that is communities and people taking one of the most essential life ingredients back into our own control. It is a natural relationship, right? So we need to do more to build those types of things. But we also need to make sure that we're not leaving everything on those individual DIY actions, because eventually you hit the ceiling, right? So eventually you hit the ceiling of the limits of the system that you're in. So maybe you want to go car free all the time, but boy, you just got a job somewhere across town and there's no way to get there unless you drive. So all of a sudden you're not doing what you wanted to do in your own DIY lifestyle. So then maybe you actually need to start getting involved with local transit issues, right? So we need to kind of make that connection back, that we're not just going to either green consume our way through this challenge or get to it by all just kind of saying, forget the politics, I'm just going to go and get some chickens, right? Like, believe me, I'm totally into that. I'm not mocking at all. You know, I'm growing a lot of food. But we have to make people realize that there is a limit to that we need to get to systemic thinking. You know, in terms of Canada versus other countries, in a way, I'd much rather deal with the challenge here, because typically the environment is in the top list of 5 concerns. Usually it's about third, and it has stayed there. I mean, sometimes it drops. But compared to the US, wow, it never even makes the list. Like, that's even when Canadians are self-reporting that, right? So even if we don't spend a lot of time day to day out in nature, it still is part of our identity. And it still is just part of our day-to-day life, even in cities, because our weather is edgier. You know, you know, you guys are all kind of bundled up, you know, like we have to think a little bit more about still surviving the elements, even if we're in the city. So I don't know, I guess I personally, I feel kind of like, you know, it's right there. It's just under the surface. We haven't lost it. We haven't lost that love or connection. It is getting buried but it's not as far gone as in other places. And in part, you might argue that some of the Northern European countries have progressed very well on the environment because they decimated their virgin forests and a lot of their natural resources several decades ago, and they learned the lesson, they hit their limit. Have we learned our lesson and hit our limit in Canada? We're still a really small people living on a big, big land. So I'd rather we don't have to learn the lesson that way. Thank you.